piece by Edvard Grieg is called Homesickness, and it's the final one of 6 lyric pieces, opus 57. The main theme of this little piece is quite extraordinary because it consists of the same phrase played 4 times, but the harmonies are different every time. So whereas the melody stays the same, it's the harmonies that provide the musical development. And I'm going to have a look at how exactly this is happening. So let's begin by having a look at the melody. So we are in E minor, and the theme moves back and forth between E and G scale-wise. And there are 2 notes that are longer than the others, and they are the first G and the last E. And since they're longer, and since they're also both on the strong beats, they are central notes, and therefore the overall melodic line is falling from G to E, like a little sigh. And then the other notes it's like a pathway taking us between these 2 notes. That's the main phrase. And then when it's played the second time, it's changed a little bit because this longer G has an appoggiatura added on A. So there's a slight variation. And then the third phrase repeats the first, and the fourth phrase repeats the second. And therefore the melody consists of 2 pairs of 2 phrases. The first simple, and the second a little more intense because of this appoggiatura. And then there's a slight little change at the end in the fourth phrase. There's a little grace note added. Just makes slight more variation towards the end. And that's all. That's the melody. The harmonies supporting the first phrase are quite straightforward. It's simply the subdominant A minor and the tonic E minor. And the tonic is in its first inversion, so G is in the bass, and therefore we don't feel that we land on it. It simply stands as a tonic chord on our way forward. And then since there's a G in the melody, the first chord, the subdominant, is actually a subdominant 7th chord, an A minor 7th. Nice and simple for a start. The second phrase is already a little bit more complicated because here we get this rather dissonant chord, which resolves into a clean, nice A major chord. Now, if you remember the appoggiatura from before, the A that resolves into G, once it has resolved, we've got these 4 notes. And if we're going to look at them as a chord, what kind of chord this is, this would be the G minor 6th chord. And then B flat is in the bass. So that's the chord in itself. But if we're going to look at functional harmony and look at the relationship between this chord and the other chords around it, then we've got to do something else. You've got to ask yourself, what's the function of this? Well, the function is to have tension which is being released, and therefore this is a dominant resolving. It's a secondary dominant because it resolves into not the tonic but into this subdominant major chord. And let's have a look at how that's happening exactly, because it's not the typical dominant. The typical dominant to A major would be E major 7. And so what we do with this E major 7 is we change it to an E minor 7, and then the 5th degree of the chord, the B natural, is being lowered to a B flat. And then we got the chord. And then also, typically, if it had been a typical dominant, then the leading tone would have been the G sharp, resolving into A. But since G sharp is changed to G natural, it's not leading anywhere, and therefore it's the B that's been lowered to B flat. It's the B flat now that resolves into A instead. So it's the B flat that is our main leading tone here, together with the D in the alto voice. And therefore the function of this first chord is a minor secondary dominant with a lowered fifth degree, resolving into the subdominant. So now we have looked at the harmonies, but something we should also do is look at the intervals, because something which is quite significant here at the opening of the first phrase, this minor seventh chord, is that when it's laid out like this, it consists of two open fifths. There's a pair, there's a fifth in the lower voice pair, and there is one in the upper voice pair. So even though this chord, this minor seventh chord, is quite colorful, when it's laid out like this, there's actually also something quite empty about it, because of these empty open intervals, and it makes the music sound very desolate. But then, in the second phrase, there's still a fifth in the upper voices, but there's now a tritone in the lower voices, which creates more tension. And of course the tritone is resolved into a fifth as the dominant resolves. So we can see that when we go from the first phrase to the second phrase, we go from a harmony that consists of two open fifths to a harmony that consists of a tritone and a fifth. And the fifth is resolved into a fourth. So already here there's a dramaturgical change. We go from something rather simple, rather empty, to something much more tense. And as a matter of fact, there's no tritone in the harmonies in the first phrase. It's only introduced in the second phrase, and it signifies how the intensity goes up as we move along. In the third phrase, the harmonies are no longer functionally connected to each other, because here it's C major and F sharp major seventh. This is a rather unusual moment. What are these chords? Well, they're a tritone apart because it's C and F sharp, and therefore they are functionally they're as far away from each other as they can be, and therefore they have no functional connection. So it's the first time there's no functional connection between the two chords. And also there's a point about the tritone, which is that we had no tritone in the first phrase, and then in the second phrase it was introduced as part of the harmony. And now in the third phrase it has become the distance between the two harmonies. So you can see how this drama of the tritone is expanding as the music moves along. But also, since the harmonies are not functionally connected, and also since they're suddenly in this low register, they seem to be these blocks that are simply standing there. They're not telling a story, they're not connecting to one another, and also they're not as dissonant as the harmonies that preceded them. And therefore it seems as if the music has some kind of self-realizing moment. It's as if it goes away from its local emotions that it was wrapped up in the first two phrases, and is now expanding itself out into having a bigger perspective. Also, something interesting is that this is the first time a phrase ends on a dominant, because the first phrase ended on the tonic, the second ended on the subdominant, but it had a bidominant preceding it, so this subdominant still has a kind of tonic function. It sounds stable. But in the third phrase, the final chord does not sound stable. It's a dominant seventh chord, so it's open towards what's going to follow it. And therefore it also seems all the more like a moment of self-realization, as if the music is now able to look beyond itself and is able to approach the conclusion that it's about to make. The fourth phrase is simply dominant seventh resolving into tonic. And the dominant that the third phrase ended on, this F sharp major seventh, is the dominant to the dominant. So it's resolved as it should. Dominant to dominant, dominant, tonic. So this ending of the melody is the most predictable harmonically, and it's the place where everything seems to come to a conclusion. We've gone through different harmonic changes, and now everything is very simplified and very much like a way of rounding off. So now we have looked at all the harmonic changes and all the changes in tension and release and in different registers and so on. But there's still one more aspect that it's important to pay attention to, and that's the fact that up until the fourth and final phrase, all the harmonies contain the note E, and this E is kept in the tenor voice throughout. Up until here there's always this E present, and of course this is a very good skill from Grieg that he writes it like this, because in spite of all these big changes harmonically, he still has some element that keeps the music together very much. It's never harmonically going off into a strange direction. There's always something that keeps everything very much together, and that's this E. But also because this E is here all the time, when this dominant seventh finally comes in the fourth phrase, in spite of it being such a well-known chord and such a simple thing, it seems so refreshing, and also because of this aspect, it seems all the more like a conclusion, because it's the first time that a chord is able to break us away from this E that has kept the music together all the time. So it's very much refreshing and very much concluding to have this dominant seventh. And then there's also a point to make about this little grace note. It's just a small detail, it's such a small thing to just add this little note, and in the context of this very sad music, you could maybe say that it's a little bit like a tear or something. It's just this tiny little thing that in itself is quite insignificant, but it still colors the music just a little bit more. So now that we have been through the whole theme and have made it clear what kind of harmonies there are, then we could make a possible interpretation going something like this. I'm lonely and sad. I'm desperate to get home, to my sweet home. But alas, I am far away, and I must accept that I am not going back. Now, obviously, it doesn't really make sense to put these kinds of words on something like this, because the music itself will always be stronger than anything you could ever say about it. But what I'm trying to do is to make some kind of description of the story that is taking place here, because this is definitely a story. It begins in this relatively simple way, then it gets more tense, then this deep register opens up underneath it, and then there's the simplification at the end with the dominant seventh going into tonic. So it's definitely some kind of story. There's a progression taking place, and we can't really describe what the story is, but I'm trying to add some words to sort of signify what the story could be, and also to show that in spite of having a theme which is so simple and it's the same phrase that's being played over and over again, it's actually possible to make a lot of emotional variety and make a lot of dramaturgy simply by changing the harmonies. And this theme shows us how big a role harmonization plays in the experience of music. After the theme comes this little middle passage, where the lower voice imitates the upper voice, and then after that the main theme comes back once again, but at the end of it we don't just hear the tonic like we did at first. We now hear this. And this is quite interesting, because these three chords at the end are summoning up the harmonic progressions of the main theme. Because the first chord is this F major seventh chord, and this has some relationship with the first chord we heard, this minor 7th chord, in that both these chords are made up of 5th and so they are harmonically related to each other by this 5thness. So there's some kind of link back to the first harmony, to the qualities of the first harmony. And then what happens is that the F changes to F sharp, whereby the tritone is introduced, just as it was in the second phrase of the theme. And then after that, finally comes the tonic. So these 3 chords progress in the same way as the main theme, in that they open with this 5thness and then move through the tritone and back to the tonic. And therefore it's harmonically summoning up what's been going on in the theme, and therefore it seems like a very fulfilling way to end. Then there's also a middle section, and I'm not going to analyze it, I just want to point out a few details about it. So this section is like happy memories, and it's written so that it's in direct contrast to the main section. And the most obvious way that it's in contrast is because it's played in the high register, and the main section was played in the low register. Also it's in major, whereas the main section was in minor. And also Grieg asks us to use the una corda pedal, which creates this sort of otherworldly, more transparent, and probably therefore also more distant sound. So it's this moment that comes in as a distant memory. And something very extraordinary harmonically is that Grieg has written it so that whereas the main section we saw was so full of dissonances and there was so much tension and the chords were working their way through so many things, in this middle section there's no tension between the harmonies at all. They simply take over one after another, and therefore this music seems so free. It's really like a memory of a time when everything was okay, when we were back safe at home. And to make such a big contrast has a very powerful effect, to come out of this and then into this completely free, transparent world where all the tension is gone. Now, of course, we do, after this section, go back into the main section, and then the music ends tragically. So it was indeed just a little happy memory here in the middle. Thank you for watching. I hope that you liked what you heard. And if you did, you can subscribe and stay updated. And you can also find Floridus Academy on Instagram and Facebook, where there are also updates about different music-related stuff. And feel free to comment and make suggestions if there is some piece that you would like me to analyze or something music-related that you would like me to talk about. And then I'll see what I can do.